If you want to create truly unique sounding kick drums in Ableton Live, then this video is for you because I'm going to show you 2 different ways to synthesize your own kick drums just using the stock tools in Ableton Live. So my promise to you, by the end of this video, you're going to finally understand how kick drum synthesis works, what goes into crafting unique sounding kick drums, and if you stick with me till the end, I'm going to also reveal some of my favorite mixing hacks for creating kick drums that stand the test of time and crush it on club systems, small earbuds, and basically everywhere else. First of all, why would you even want to synthesize your own kick drums if there are thousands, if not millions, of kick drum samples available out there? Well, there are actually 2 reasons for that. Reason number 1, if you just rely on sample packs, you have to accept the fact that 90% of kick drum samples are garbage. And I don't mean this disrespectful towards the people who create these samples, but I think most sample packs are just bloated with fluff and only 10% of the stuff is actually usable. If all of the producers rely on just 10% of those sample packs, well, there's a question, how unique can it be, even if you later on mix that kick drum and it sounds a little bit different. Now you could argue that you layer 2 samples together and this creates something unique, and yes, absolutely, but a lot of producers just don't go that far. They just pick the sample pack, run with it, and that's it. But the second reason is even more important. I believe that knowing how to synthesize your own kick drums makes you a more capable producer, you understand what goes into kick drum synthesis, and you can still decide whether a sample is worth using, or if you maybe want to layer and augment or enhance a sample with your own synthesized kick drum. So all in all, I think there's a huge benefit to knowing how this works. So the fastest way to synthesize a kick drum in Ableton Live is to just use the drum synth that is made for that. You go to the DS Kick, that's the drum synthesizer for kick drums, and already you can see you have a couple of parameters that are worth digging into. Pitch is obviously the fundamental note. I'll just show you what this sounds like right now. And the interesting thing is that this is independent from what you draw in as MIDI notes. So I've drawn in a F0, but if I transpose this now, the note stays the same. Now I believe when you synthesize kick drums, you should do it with purpose. So you should have some kind of an end result in mind. Do you want a clean kick drum, a punchy kick drum, a distorted, aggressive kick drum? What are the characteristics? And then you can think about how to achieve them. So let's say we want a punchy, slightly distorted, modern techno kick drum. How will we do this here? Step 1 is to define the fundamental frequency of your kick drum. So what note is our kick, essentially? You can define this here with the pitch setting. And this corresponds to the closest musical note here. Since we don't have a song around this kick drum yet, we don't know what key it's in, and I'm going to leave this in the standard setting. Now I get this question a lot. Should my kick drum be the root note of my song, the key that the song is in? There is no right or wrong. There are definitely benefits to having the kick drum set to the fundamental frequency of the entire musical piece. It just strengthens the foundation and the low end is just more consistent. But then in some cases, it sounds more charming if it's slightly off key, and especially with very saturated kicks, very characterful kicks. They sometimes jump out of this and it sounds fantastic. So let your ears be the final judge and don't think that you always have to tune your kick perfectly to the song. This is up to taste. There is no 100% right or wrong. Now let's shape our kick a bit. We can play around with the decay, which means how long is the kick ringing out. This is a super long kick, and the problem with super long kicks is that they don't leave much room for anything else in the low end. I would go for something that's a bit more snappy. But also keep in mind that the deeper the pitch of your kick drum, the longer it actually needs to ring out to make it possible to display this fundamental frequency. Long sound waves obviously take a little bit of time to unfold. It definitely makes sense to dial in a setting where it sounds snappy, but you can still hear a little bit of that fundamental tone. And you can also later on cut this off a little bit if you want to. With the envelope here, this is how snappy it sounds. So this would sound super dull. And by the way, these little clicky sounds that you hear, this is a problem in the drum synth because it doesn't give you complete control over the envelope. It just has this like general setting and you hope that it sounds good in most cases. But this is definitely a problem with this quick and dirty approach. So if you want the kick to be more pounding, you have the envelope setting at definitely above 50%. And obviously with the volume, you control the final output. Now, what else do we have here? This drive/OT is basically a saturation curve that you can add. doesn't allow you that much detail like the saturator plugin in Ableton. So if you want to have a specific type of saturation, I would go for that. And these are some additional harmonics that you can add in. This would be a bit too tonal for my taste. And with the attack setting, you can soften the curve a tiny bit. Now this obviously gets rid of the clicky sound, at least at the beginning part, but the issue here is that it also takes away from the snap. So I would keep this like relatively short. If this sounds too dull and not snappy enough, you can add in a bit of click. My issue with that click is that it's not adding a special character, it's just like a tiny bit of top end click coming in. So if I were you, I would try to augment the click in a different way by, for example, sneaking in a different percussion sample or a different kick drum from a sampled kick drum that I can blend with this one here. Now that last little button here is a phase flip button. So this flips the phase 180 degrees. So if the kick drum makes this movement in the beginning, it would then make this movement here. Now, why is this important? It actually becomes really important once you start layering this kick drum with another one, for example. Then you can try out by flipping the phase which combination sounds better so that they are in phase as much as possible. It also makes sense to test against the bass line in a context of a song just to make sure that your low end is not phasing out. By the way, I've made a detailed video about mixing kick and bass that you can check out here. It goes into all these details. As you can see, the drum synth is a super quick and powerful way to synthesize unique kick drums. It is fast, it is effective, but it's also a little bit limited. And so in the next part of this video, I'm going to reveal the most powerful way to synthesize kick drums in Ableton Live. It's actually one of my favorite techniques. I'm going to reveal this process step by step. But before we get there, I would like to share a free gift with you. It's called the Finisher Framework. It helps you with 3 simple steps that you can implement right away to finish at least one great sounding song per month. I think this is a fantastic goal to have. You can grab it for free at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description. So the most powerful way to synthesize unique kick drums in Ableton Live, in my opinion, is to use Operator. Now, I know that Operator scares a lot of producers because it's FM synthesis and they don't really understand it, but don't worry, I'm going to explain this step by step. It's going to be very easy to follow and very thorough. So here we have Operator, and I have deactivated everything except for the first oscillator here. Different to this drum synth that we saw before is that here everything is being influenced by the MIDI notes. So here if I pitch it up, this is being reflected. If I make the notes longer, this is also affecting the sound. So I just want you to keep this in mind when designing your kick drum. This definitely makes a difference. I recommend that you keep the kick drum setting between C0 and C1. This will be the octave for the fundamental note. And then everything else that happens in terms of overtones, you actually create by sound design. In terms of length of the MIDI notes, I would keep them quite short. So either as 8th notes or 16th sometimes. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of kick drum sound design in Operator. First of all, you don't need to know anything about FM synthesis at this very stage of the process because we just have one oscillator activated. It's just a sine wave playing, as you can hear. That's a super deep sine wave, and we don't have any other oscillator activated. And the first thing you need to understand about kick drum synthesis is that you need to create a so-called pitch envelope for the kick drum to sound like a kick drum. So you can activate the pitch envelope here. Keep this at 100%. The spread has to stay at 0. Doesn't matter for now. And then you can transpose the starting point of this. You already hear this sliding sound. You can basically do everything also over here in this envelope. Bring the final sustained note down. So this would be a super deep sustained note now. Then you hear like it's sliding up again at the end. This is this part here where you have the release time pitched up again. This is the end here. And then you can dial in an exact shape how you want that kick drum to sound. Whoa. This already sounds much more promising. This is a deep, nice, rich kick sound, but it's still relatively clean. So how do we now get this timbre and character into the kick drum? The first step of character that you can add is by actually applying a filter. Here, this filter section, you have a 24 or 12 dB per octave filter. I think the 24 in most cases makes more sense. You can define a filter setting from clean filters to distorted filters. So I actually like the OSR quite a bit. We can add a filter driver mount. Now it starts to sound really rich. If you want to add even more character, you can go to this wave shaping section here. It's getting pretty extreme. I think this type of sonic architecture is better outside of the kick drum. So I would leave this later on for a saturation plugin, but theoretically you could do it all inside here. You can then make the kick drum a little bit more snappy by applying some envelope to the filter. So here you can, for example, go to 100% and dial in the exact filter envelope. When does the filter open up and when does it close down? And you can dial in the exact setting of how that kick drum is supposed to snap in the end. Now already, without even going into FM synthesis, we have created a kick drum that is much more fine-tuned than the one we had in the drum synth before. Now it's time to take this to the next level and add some character with FM synthesis. Don't worry, it's going to be super easy to follow. And if you get any value out of this video so far, then consider subscribing, consider liking this video. It helps me keep putting out these videos, and it also helps you because the wonderful algorithm will suggest more awesome music production tutorials to you by channels that are high quality. So FM synthesis just means that one oscillator is influencing the sound of another oscillator. I can show you this inside of Operator pretty easily. So we'll activate the second oscillator here, and you can dial in, for example, a slightly different wave shape. Let's use a triangle here. And this shows you the overtone series. You could also theoretically draw in other overtones and create your own wave that you can see here. But actually I'm going to stick with the standard triangle and add in a little bit of that. Already you hear that the timbre and the texture of the kick drum is changing quite a bit. Now I can make this more extreme by tuning the oscillator that influences the first oscillator. Now to me this doesn't sound good, so I'll leave this down here. Much more happy with this, just a tiny bit, but in the same tuning. And then just play around and see if I want to have more overtones, more drive in there, then I could use, for example, a square or a saw setting. Let me just walk you through a couple of them. Talking about really, really distorted drums. This would still be something in the kind of fundamental frequencies of that kick drum with just a couple of overtones added. But how do we now add an actual character layer to the kick drum? This is where one of the most underused settings of Operator comes into play, and that's the routing section. Because here we can decide how these oscillators influence one another. So we are still in the standard setting where everything influences from top to bottom. This one influences this one, influences this one, influences this one. But if you go to the setting, you can also go in parallel and, for example, have two different routes. So one route of those two that is then being mixed with one route of those two in parallel. So this is later on being summed together. Here, this would be interesting if you want to keep the standard one that we just dialed in before separate, and you want one layer of character kick drum that's created by these other three. So let's maybe do this. So we'll start with the basic layer and this one here. And sometimes it's nice to, for example, use a sine wave and drive it with noise. That's cool. Or just use noise straight off the gate. That's also possible. see how this sounds if it's being influenced. Let's take a sine wave here on this one and then use noise to shape the other one. We'll influence the sine wave here with the noise coming from here. And then use very different texture on this one. Let's use something like a saw. You dial in the exact fine-tuned settings just as you want. So this would be a very atonal setting, so very noise-driven with just the fundamental frequency underneath. If you want some more tone and character into this, then you can change the tuning, for example, of this one. And don't worry, later on you could also filter stuff out again if you have too many overtones. Now I actually liked this fundamental one here quite a bit. Let's see how we can work with this now. If you feel like your kick drum isn't snappy enough yet and rings out a little bit too long, you can sometimes shape it nicely by using the LFO setting here. So here we can apply an LFO. This is a sine wave right now, and you can change the rate of that LFO. This is like how long or how short the cycle of the LFO is, and here you can dial in the amount of it. So let's try this out and make the kick drum even more snappy. And you have to activate this retrigger setting. That means like every time a new MIDI note plays, the LFO starts from the initial point. So this can add a little bit of nice definition. Now, I've promised you a couple of mixing hacks that you can use later on, so let me walk you through them right now. First of all, let's add a little bit of saturator. I think saturator is fantastic to applying that final like overdrive curve that you want in your kick drum, or at least in some kick drums. My favorite way of doing this is actually use something like the medium curve. It's not too distorted, but also not too clean. This adds really nice, rich overtones to the kick. Let's do a little bit of EQing. As you can see, there's excessive low end going on. So I don't always filter out the low end in a kick drum, but here it definitely is a little bit overpowering. And you can sometimes get a really nice little boost here with the corner frequency. This definitely has some sweet spots that you can use. If you are too aggressive with your cut, you actually lose a little bit of the fundamental note of the kick, which is not what you want. So sometimes it makes sense to go for not an as steep curve here. If you want more of the fundamental note, you can boost it around the fundamental frequency, which here is more in like 50, 60 hertz region. This is very low. So I would rather emphasize some of that like punch of the kick drum that you feel in your chest, which is more in the 90, 100, 120, sometimes up to 150 hertz region. So let's look for that. If you want more of the click sound, you can boost it around the 1000 to 6000 hertz region. And very often it makes sense to take out a little bit of low mid-range, so 300, 500, 800-ish. But to be honest with you, this is also something that you could just dial in the sound design before that. By the way, I've made a detailed EQ video, which you can watch over here. And also, like I said, a mixing and kick and bass video, which you can also check out here. Let's now add a little bit of compression. And I'm using the dry wet compression setting. This definitely makes sense here because I don't want to compress the entire kick drum. I want to just emphasize a little bit the oomph that I'm getting out of it. This is a really tiny amount of compression. Make it a bit more obvious. Now, some more advanced techniques would be to use a Transient Designer, for example. This does not exist as an Ableton plugin, I have to admit. So this would be the SPL Transient Designer. To bring out some of the click and sometimes make the kick drum shorter if it's too long. It's definitely one of my secret weapons. Then we can play around with a clipping plugin. So a free one that you can use by the same company, Kazrock. Now this is when you want to make your Shrunts kicks. When I use clippers, I mainly clip maybe 1 dB, a little bit less typically. And then you can use a final limiter also after that. So that would be pretty heavy processing right now. I don't always do this, but I've promised you to show you some tricks. Now for limiting, I also don't really like the Ableton limiter as much. I just think there are more transparent options or more characterful options even. For example, use the FabFilter Pro L, and here there is an aggressive algorithm that sometimes sounds very nice on kick drums. Let's make the attack relatively sharp here. Quick release time as well. Perfect alignment between the channels. Now you can use a 1-to-1 in-out setting. So what goes into the limiter also goes out to the limiter, and what's in between is getting squashed. And remember, I'm not using the limiter to get the signal limited. I'm using it to add an extra character to it that I find nice. All right, so that is it. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment below if you want me to explain the limiter settings in more detail, or generally how I use the FabFilter limiter also for mastering. I'm curious to hear from you. If you have any follow-up questions whatsoever, just put them in the comments. I'm super active there. I would love to see you in the next video again.